l'étoile. Et dans le cadre des travaux soutenus par le pacte d'excellence, c'est avec un grand honneur et un grand plaisir que j'accueille ici à l'Université de Liège Bob Slavin. Je l'accueille 20 ans après qu'il ait été fait docteur honoris causa de l'Université de Liège. Bob Slavin est... Excusez-moi, je suis un peu émue, je vais je l'accueille donc 20 ans après qu'il ait été fait docteur honoris causa de l'Université de Liège. Et évidemment, sa carrière, ses publications ont évolué depuis. Il est à la fois le directeur du Centre pour la recherche et l'éducation de l'Université John Hopkins de Baltimore. Il est docteur honoris causa de nombreuses universités. Si je devais vous détailler son CV de 48 pages, je prendrais, je pense, tout le temps de l'exposer. Donc, je peux vous dire, et vous le savez sans doute si vous êtes ici, que c'est un des auteurs les plus publiés dans les revues les plus prestigieuses et les plus lus en sciences de l'éducation. Mais je n'ai pas prévu de détailler ce CV de 48 pages, que j'aurais pu résumer en un mot. En fait, Bob Slavin est une star dans notre domaine. Mais les stars, vous le savez, en mai, se baladent sur la croisette. Ce n'est donc pas en tant que star que nous avons invité Bob Slavin. Nous l'avons invité parce qu'il est judicieux, sans doute, dans un moment de réforme comme celui dans lequel nous nous trouvons avec le pacte d'excellence, de bénéficier de 40 ans d'expertise au service des élèves. Je dirais même plus, nous bénéficions non pas de 40 ans d'expertise, mais bien de 2 fois 40 ans d'expertise, parce qu'il n'est pas si vieux que cela. Mais il est venu accompagné de Nancy Madden, son épouse, mais pour ce qui nous occupe, la directrice de la Fondation Success for All, qui a un CV aussi impressionnant que son mari et qui travaille aussi à la John Hopkins Université. Et à deux, ils ont réalisé, je pense, le rêve de tout pédagogue, c'est-à-dire finalement mêler l'action et la recherche au service des élèves. Vous connaissez sans doute tous le projet pour lequel ils sont le plus connus, c'est-à-dire Success for All, ce projet qui a débuté très localement à Baltimore en 1987, où l'idée était d'appliquer ce qu'on savait de ce qui était efficace dans la recherche, mais de le mettre en place concrètement sur le terrain, avec toujours la volonté d'évaluer, d'innover et d'étendre. Ça, c'est Success for All, dirigé par Nancy Madden, et c'est appliqué maintenant dans des milliers d'écoles aux États-Unis et dans d'autres pays. Je voudrais aussi présenter le deuxième cheval de bataille de Bob Slavin et l'entreprise Best Evidence Encyclopédia. Il y a pour Bob et Nancy une obsession de chercher, d'être à l'affût de tous les projets, de tous les programmes qui sont mis en place et de les prendre en compte pour résumer pour les acteurs de l'éducation et pour le chercheur, pour donner des informations sur ce qui fonctionne. Ça, c'est le projet Best Evidence Encyclopédia. Et effectivement, le but est de faire une encyclopédie qui demande autant de passion, d'obstination et de travail que demande toute encyclopédie. Et vous avez donc là 2 personnes qui ont une réelle connaissance encyclopédique de tout ce qui se fait dans le domaine des sciences de l'éducation. Ces 2 exemples très fructueux de leur travail, pour moi, illustrent parfaitement 2 piliers fondamentaux qu'ils ont mis en interdépendance constamment, c'est-à-dire la recherche et l'action. Et je dirais que le 3e pilier, et qui est peut-être finalement le plus important, est la grande humanité qu'il donne à tout ce travail, qui n'est pas un travail, qui est une passion au service des élèves, et particulièrement des élèves les plus défavorisés. Je vais maintenant laisser la parole à Céline pour nous parler des réformes éducatives fondées sur les preuves.
Merci. Il faut dire que je parle français un peu, mais ça serait embêtant de tout le monde si je continue comme ça. Donc, je parlerai en anglais, mais avec PowerPoints en français. Et s'il y a des fautes dans les PowerPoints, ce ne sont pas ma faute. Anyway, now to English. So, I also want to introduce a student, Marta Pellegrini from Italy, who has been working with us on the Best Evidence Encyclopedia. And this has been a labor of many, many hands to try to review everything that anybody has ever done from pre-kindergarten through the end of secondary school to try to improve student achievement and put them on a common scale and use rigorous methods to summarize them. That's not in the PowerPoint, so. So, what is the problem here? The problem is that education reform is constantly changing. Schools actually do change a great deal. They change in accountability standards, measurement of children's progress, in standards, curricula, in governance. There are always going back and forth between an emphasis on local control versus national control, or charter schools versus ordinary public schools versus private schools. There is constant change in terms of centralization or the autonomy of individual schools, all of which are very interesting, and we can have, perhaps they have consequences, but they operate on a pendulum. Meaning, and what I mean by a pendulum is that whatever exists today will be the opposite within a few years. And the reason is that any of these changes will not be satisfying, and so then the people in charge decide on the opposite, and they try something else. And we go through a constant process of turmoil, of change, that does not move us forward, that does not help us to move forward in any consistent way. And in our society, more broadly, there are many activities that operate in this way. For example, fashion and art, and of course education itself, operate where change happens. Everyone's very excited for a while, and then there's a reaction against it, and then the opposite happens for a while. So, ties get wider and then they get narrower, or hemlines go up or they go down, or, the various things are popular. And they're popular because they're new, and then as soon as they are no longer new, somebody comes up with something else that then becomes popular. And change happens, but it's like this. It doesn't go forward. In in education specifically, how does change happen? At the school level, it changes a lot by word of mouth. Because local principal or teachers hear what other teachers are doing or other schools are doing, and they say, hey, that sounds like a good idea. And then they might change their practices in that direction. Or politics. A new government gets elected, and they may have a different philosophy of education, so all of a sudden there are different things that happen. But as soon as that government goes out of power, it goes back in some other direction. Maybe more in the US than in Europe, marketing plays a big role. There are all kinds of books and software and professional development that's sold to schools, and then whether, so companies may be doing good business and selling things and convincing people to use something. But when people get tired of it, then the business drops that product and sells something else. This has to change. There are other areas of our society in which progress is not based on fashion, but it's based on evidence. The classic case is medicine. Everyone talks about that as the example of where evidence really drives practice over time, and that would be true. It wasn't always true. Medicine 100 years ago was just like education is today. There were some things that were known. There were some things that were known and not widely used. There was an awful lot that wasn't used, and or that wasn't known. And medicine had a relatively low status, and schools of medicine had a relatively low status compared to today. And if you got sick, there were not very many solutions. And things improved over time, but very, very slowly. My own grandfather would always say he would never go to a hospital because that's where you go to die. A hospital wasn't seen as a place that knew how to do anything. It was just a place in which, after all other solutions had been tried, then you just go for the end. Now, medicine has changed dramatically with the development of treatments for polio, for sulfa drugs, for development of penicillin, and then and perhaps the most important thing, the most important discovery in medicine was in 1962. There was a law that required that before medicines could be sold in the United States, they had to be subjected to randomized experiments. They had to be tested out in an experiment in which subjects were randomly assigned to receive the treatment or not receive the treatment. And although we don't usually think of a law as being a medical breakthrough, if you look at the evidence in terms of the pace of discovery of new treatments across all of medicine, 1962 is a remarkable turning point, where before 1962 the pace was rather slow. After 1962 it took off at a very rapid pace and continues to this day. Not to say that medicine is perfect, but every year progress is made in medicine, and the requirement, the unquestioned requirement is that each treatment has been carefully evaluated in a randomized experiment, found to be effective, before it can be widely disseminated. Now, people often respond, well, medicine, those are doctors, they go to school for many years, and they're all taught the importance of science, and education's not like that. So let me pose another example, which is agriculture. Agriculture, we're talking about farmers who may be extraordinary in their own way. At least they're all outstanding in their fields. That's a little joke. Okay. All right. Well, if your English is very good, you probably got it. Anyway, but in agriculture, there is a long tradition of trying out new seeds, new fertilizer, new treatments for animals, new breeds, new, whatever, new ways of plowing fields. Everything is tried out in randomized experiments, and if things are effective, then they are disseminated to farmers all over the world. As a result, the pace of development in agriculture has been, once again, utterly extraordinary. Just as one example that I like, it's, that actually seems to be true because it says it on the internet. In 1950, the average dairy cow produced half as much milk as a dairy cow does today. Now, if you think about what that means, it means that if we were continuing, if we had the same number of cows, which means the same amount of land and all the things that cows require, it would only feed half the number of people. So if cows were only that productive, pretty soon all the people would have to move away to leave enough room for all those cows that were underproducing. But really, in every area of agriculture, the progress of science is such that we can feed 8 billion people on the Earth, on an Earth that 100 years ago contained far, far fewer people than that, and was barely supporting itself in food at the same time. Engineering, obviously in engineering we've made remarkable progress, and a lot of that has to do with experimentation and systematic use of science in the service of better lives for people. If you consider engineering to be better lives, it isn't always, but creates the possibility. And in each of these areas, and many more, it's not only a question of more rapid progress, it's also a question of creating a dynamic of progress, an expectation of progress. Several years ago, my father needed a heart valve, and his doctors said, you could probably do fine with your current valve. It's faulty, it has to be replaced, but you do fine with your current valve for 5 years. Keep your current valve because research is progressing so fast in this area that there will be better valves in 5 years. Can you imagine telling your children, don't worry, don't study algebra now, because there will be much better solutions for algebra in 5 years? Okay, that's a bad idea, but the idea that we could expect confidently that in each area of education that there would be better solutions for long-standing problems would be quite extraordinary, and each of these fields went through a cycle of ignoring evidence adopted a culture of evidence and began to make rapid change. And there's no reason, whatever, that education could not do the same. So here is a vision of what I'm talking about might look like. So first, and why are you all flipping your pages? This is in French already. You're looking at the same thing?
We want to see the English because we have both here.
How come they all got the English and I don't? So imagine that in every subject, in every grade level, there were many approaches that had been proven in high quality, ideally randomized experiments to be effective. Proven according to the same kinds of methods and standards that are typical of medicine and agriculture and engineering and other subjects. So, imagine that no government tells schools that they must use this or that, but rather that schools could decide, as units, not just individual teachers, but schools could decide that the approach that they want to use is this one for algebra, this one for beginning reading, and that one for science, whatever they like. And the government would be equally happy, whichever of those the teachers decide to use, because the government would know that whichever one it is, it's a successful program. It's a proven program that should be able to make the difference that the government is trying to achieve. And when I say government, I really mean government on the behalf of the people that elected them, of parents and of the community and of the society and of the economy, would be confident that whichever thing the teachers were choosing was effective, was going to make the difference. Imagine also that at the same time that there was a constant process of research and development that was creating new programs, new approaches, that was researching the existing ones and finding where they were weak and making changes to existing ones to improve them constantly. And that in this process, each year, schools have a larger set of proven practices, proven programs that they could choose from. Now, what you can easily see is if the description I just gave existed, if schools and teachers were looking for proven programs and using the ones that did have strong evidence of effectiveness, there would be strong motivations for publishers to create those programs, for nonprofit organizations, for universities, for many different actors in the education process to be creating and evaluating better and better programs. One thing I think a lot of people don't realize about medicine is that most research in medicine, especially most research on medical treatments, is not paid for by the government. It's paid for by drug companies. And the government watches those experiments very, very carefully, and you have to document what you've done extremely carefully. But the government doesn't pay for those things. And the reason that the drug companies are willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes on creation of new drugs is because they are convinced that this drug will, you know, if it's successful, will have a market. It will be widely used and they'll make their money back. That being said, the majority of the time, those experiments don't work. But they know that. And they know that having successes from time to time overcomes the fact that not everything works the first time you do it. Or not everything works ever in some cases. So imagine now that we have the same dynamic in education. There would be many actors working very hard to create and evaluate proven programs, and that as soon as they found something and it was certified to be proven, there would be many, many schools who would use it. The result, I think you would agree, is that practice would get better every year. Outcomes would get better every year. Instead of talking about, you know, what are our PISA scores in comparison to Hungary or Italy, we'd be saying, oh, remember when PISA scores were so bad back in the 2017 school year? Because everybody would be improving in terms of their outcomes. The importance of this is not only in terms of improving PISA scores, but especially because my assumption would be, and this is just an uninformed but probable guess, is that if you find more and more effective programs, the children who would benefit most would be those who are succeeding least well in the current system. Because frankly, the children who are already succeeding, they're doing fine with the current teaching. They could probably do better. But there are a lot of children who are just not succeeding, who would be gaining disproportionately from an evidence-based strategy, because right now, what they're getting is simply not getting them to where they need to go. Now, there are a lot of things that sound a bit like evidence-based reform, but aren't. Frequently, in the name of evidence-based reform, politicians say, well, everybody has to use this program, or this approach, or this type of approach. And it's because it's based on research. That's not evidence-based reform, partly because usually when this happens, in order to decree any kind of a program across, you know, a whole country or a whole state or a large place, you're not able to provide the kinds of supports that were necessary, that were found in the research itself to be necessary for the success. And usually it's more things being prescribed that are based on research, that are informed by research, rather than things that have actually been tested out and found to be effective. But I think that there's reason to guard against premature and top-down prescription. I think what's ideal would be that there are many different approaches, all of them proven, and that people have choices depending on the needs of their community and their school system to solve their problems. Another thing that sounds like evidence-based reform is when teachers and principals are generally justifying what they're doing by saying, well, it's kind of sort of related to what's supported by research. One of the things that we found, I don't mean we personally, but that research has found over and over again, is that there are a lot of things that are, you know, consistent with general understandings about what works, but when you actually subject them to experiments, they don't. And expecting each and every school to invent its own research-influenced practice is just not likely to lead to major change. There's just too much reason for people in the school to keep doing what they've always done, and then use the language of the research to justify it, rather than to genuinely doing something that is been found to be effective and likely to make a big difference. So, I'm not just talking in theory, you'll be pleased to know. Here I am standing in a university, and not just talking in theory. Oops, wait a minute. You're supposed to be the French version. Here we are. Would you rather have the English version? You don't care, you've got both. Okay. There are some initiatives that are taking place in the United States and in England that are moving us very far along in this direction that I'm talking about here. It's not perfect, it's not all the way there, but I just think it's useful to know that such things are possible because they're actually happening. Of course, it helps to have a much bigger country, so you guys can work on that part. First off, and perhaps most importantly, in the United States, there is a relatively recent law called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is the basic law of education for all of the United States, for the federal education laws. And it contains a definition of what are programs that have strong, moderate, or promising levels of evidence. And then it has consequences in terms of funding for certain kinds of programs that schools apply for. And I'll talk about those in a moment. What's so remarkable about this, then, is that this is the first time anywhere that there have really been consequences for using things that have an evidence base other than the expectation that because it has an evidence base it might help your own particular school. But at the governmental level, this is the first time anyone has ever done this. Another initiative in the U.S. is called Investing in Innovation. And this was a program that provided quite significant amounts of money for groups, which were universities, nonprofit organizations, school districts, and others, to invent more effective practices or to evaluate practices that already existed and already had some evidence. The Investing in Innovation has a tiered structure where you can, if you already have a lot of evidence, you can get a lot of money to scale up to disseminate the program you have. If you have a little bit of evidence, you can get a moderate amount of money to do additional research. And if you have no evidence at all, or just a reasonable rationale for why something might be effective, you can get a smaller amount, but still enough to do the initial development and evaluation of a given program. So the idea here is to expand the number of programs and practices that are available to schools as quickly as possible. That I3, Investing in Innovation, has now ended, but it's been replaced by a new program called EIR for Education, Innovation, and Research that does exactly the same thing so far. This is something that our new president may change. The Institute for Education Sciences, which is the main education agency, education research agency for the U.S. government since 2001, has been going for the longest period of time, and they have been doing funding research as well, much like the I3 research. But they've also been doing something very important. They've been doing a lot of work to try to build the skills of researchers in terms of doing randomized experiments. As a result, the number of randomized experiments that are taking place, both the funding and the number of people who can carry out these studies, the number of randomized experiments has expanded dramatically, so much so that quasi-experiments, matched experiments, are almost disappearing in the United States. Almost all big experiments are using randomized methods because of this shift. And then in England, there's something called the Education Endowment Foundation, where for reasons that nobody seems to understand, the Conservative government gave a small foundation £125 million to spend over a 15-year period to fund randomized evaluations of a wide variety of programs that could be used in England. And they claim that 25% of all schools in England are engaged in a randomized trial right now. This is a country that, just like Belgium, said, well, at least was, we were told no teacher, no school in all of England will participate in a randomized experiments. Won't happen. They're a different culture. Forget about it. Now 25% of all schools are engaged in a randomized trial on something. One might be science, one might be math, one might be reading, but it's utterly turned around the way research is seen within England. So here are the definitions in English, here they are in French, for what it means to have strong evidence, or the top levels of evidence of effectiveness. So the strong, or top level, requires that there be at least one randomized experiment that showed that the program was successful. And there's some brief discussion of what the specific definition is. The second level, moderate, requires at least one study that used a quasi-experimental design, meaning a matched design, to compare experimental and control group, and had showed positive impacts. The third level is called promising, and that one has to have at least one study that's correlational with good controls for pretests that showed a positive impact. So, contrary to many people's belief, this does not require randomized experiments, but it requires stronger evidence than government has ever required in the past. Even the promising level is a higher requirement than is typical, than typically ever existed, and well, government has never had this before. In the ESSA Act, the national law, it defines there are a few important funding areas that require evidence that falls in the top 3 of these standards. One of them is, the most important is something called school improvement. School improvement grants are provided for schools that are performing in the lowest 5% of their states. These are miserable, miserable places that usually have been miserable for a very long time. So think of the very worst schools you have ever seen, and then think what they would be like if they were a lot worse than that. And the rationale here is, of course, in schools like this, it's hard to do any harm. Let's make sure that they get the very best programs first, that they use programs that have evidence of effectiveness, that are likely to be able to solve key problems, especially having to do with performance in reading and math, to solve important, to help them to make advances. So schools that want this school improvement funding, which is quite considerable amounts of money, have to adopt programs that meet these standards. Then there are another 7 programs of federal funding in which you can get extra points on your application. You can get favored, but you're not guaranteed of funding. You can get extra points if you use programs that fall into the top 3 categories. And throughout the law, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of using proven programs, but it's not always required, or there may not be financial consequences, but there certainly is a lot of encouragement. The result has been that across the United States there's a great deal more conversation about evidence. It's not caused a revolution. It's not caused a situation in which everybody is running to use proven programs quite yet. But there's a great deal of interest in what they are, and discussion, what's this all about? I've already talked about investing in innovation, so I won't say any more about that. Talked about education and innovation research. Okay. Another thing that's been happening starting in the early 2000s that helps this entire process go forward is that there have been some reviews. There are available now free websites that make available information on proven programs. It doesn't help schools very much if you just publish a definition of what a proven program is and then say, well, go find some. Because they don't know what the standards really are. That there are a lot of details involved in knowing whether things truly meet the standards or don't. And so making it clear what we're talking about here, talking about programs with names, and phone numbers and email addresses and websites makes a big difference in terms of making it easy for schools to choose, to know about what's available to them, and to make wise choices. The oldest of these is the What Works Clearinghouse, which is a government website, and widely known. We made one that Ariane mentioned and that she worked on, and also Marta worked on, the Best Evidence Encyclopedia, that does regular reviews of research on reading and math and science and preschool programs from preschool through the end of secondary school. We've created a new one that just launched a website at the end of February this year called Evidence for ESSA. Evidence for ESSA is specific about programs that meet the ESSA standards. In other words, it's one thing to say that programs meet some standard, but now that there's a specific law that defines exactly what is required, we can present information about specific programs that makes it much more useful for school districts. And then there's a review in England called Evidence for Impact that does the same kind of work for programs in England. Actually, and the people who made it actually were our colleagues when we were at the University of York. So it's very similar to Best Evidence Encyclopedia. No, sorry, that's the French version. So, are we there yet? No. There are still many dangers. There are still many things we have to accomplish. Change of government would help a lot. But other than that, just things that are more under the control of people who are engaged in evidence-based reform. One is that we could have too few proven programs. That problem is, in the United States, in particular, is diminishing rapidly. In our Evidence for ESSA review, which was focused on, and so far we've covered reading and math, and we found about 100 programs that met ESSA standards. That's extraordinary. If you had looked using the same standards 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have found very little. But there are, and the majority of these 100 programs were evaluated in randomized experiments, so that most of them meet the strong credit category. And that's extraordinary. So that it's now the case that when people want to use a proven program, there are lots for them to choose from. More in reading than in math. More at the elementary level than at the secondary level. But still, even at secondary math, which is the smallest, there are plenty of proven approaches for people to choose from. But that's a problem. If you had too few, which as we once did, then that was a problem. If you had a situation in which proven programs were not succeeding when they were applied in practice, that would also be a very bad thing. So we have to have confidence that the programs that we identify as proven really are proven and are likely to work at scale. So, for example, in our Evidence for ESSA, we do not include programs that don't have a website, that don't have an active dissemination program, that don't give evidence that they're ready to work with lots of schools. That, you know, if you're a university and you work with 3 schools and you've got good results, well, that's fine for you, but you're not ready for prime time. And the reason to be tough about this is that we cannot have these programs failing. Once people put their confidence and their money into these programs, they must work, and that's very important. And then, of course, there's the problem that we're sure to encounter. We've been pretty kind. We've all been very polite so far. But if we have big fights about methods of research and results and you know, what works and what counts and that sort of thing, then the rest of the world will say, forget it. Bunch of academics, they're all having academic fights just like they always do. So we have to, you know, we have to have safe places in which to have legitimate arguments. That's fine. That's expected and good. But we have to be polite. We have to be recognizing that we can't have such kinds of fights that cause the world at large to abandon the entire effort. And that, many things have happened that way, so I'm not just making that up. So, here's the vision for the future again. And I hope you can see, This is not too different from the one that I started with. I hope you can see the role that each and every one of you could play in this. See, I'm keeping track of all of you, and I'm expecting you to do your part. There is a massive role, of course, for researchers, for academics, for developers, who need to bring different perspectives, different knowledge about didactics, about research methods, about pedagogy, and many other areas, to the process of developing and evaluating promising programs, and to figuring out, within a particular political context, how to disseminate proven programs. There's no question that it can be done. Can it be done in French-speaking Belgium? I don't know. That's your problem. But can it be done in principle? Of course it can. Of course it can. And it's really a question of convincing political leadership and other leaders that this is the way forward. That's not just the pendulum. That's not just this year's thing in, this year's thing out, new something else coming in. But that's genuine progress. And that's based on something that everybody can agree on. One of the things that's very heartening about the whole process that we've seen both in the US and in the UK is that evidence, absolutely positively, is not a left or a right. Everybody can agree that schools should be better for children. Everybody can agree on that. That is not a political question. How they get there? Well, we can have arguments about things that are left and right, but they never make any progress because sooner or later we'll change from left to right and then we'll be back in the same place. But evidence is something where people can come together. And the support for it has been very bipartisan. Okay, not the Trump people, but we don't know. Maybe they'll like it too. But ordinary Republicans and ordinary Democrats work very well together on this question because they can see the benefits for children. It's not just trusting in the word of the latest, theorist. It's for real, benefiting children. Parents can see that. Newspaper readers can see that. The general population can see that this is moving in a good direction, and and I think that's essential to keep that the case. It should be non-political, non-partisan, and focused on children. That's what this is about. How do we make things better for children? We can have our other fights at other times, but right now, what's best for the kids? So for more information, please contact me at Johns Hopkins University. This is a site for our Best Evidence Encyclopedia, which contains the more academic reviews of research, and the evidence for ESSA, which is of no use to you at all, because these are all American programs, but nevertheless could show what things could look like. And one of the things that's cool about it is, unlike the Woodbury Clearinghouse, it's dead simple. Anyone can understand it. And that's where we have to get. We can do complicated research on complicated ideas, make those ideas practical and effective, and then present information that makes it very, very simple for schools and politicians and others to look and see, what can I do to help my children? And that's what it's about. If you start with the very simple idea that, of course, we all agree with, that the purpose of schools is to make it possible for every single child to be successful, what the hell else are you going to do? You've got to be asking for evidence if you're serious about bringing about that change. And I'm sticking with that. That's my story.